In a small West African nation, Kofi was born into a world of privilege, the son of an elite family in a country deeply divided between a wealthy ruling class and a vast majority living in poverty. From an early age, Kofi recognized the disparities around him, but saw them not as a problem to solve, but as a challenge to overcome for himself. He believed he was destined to lead, to control, and to shape the future of his nation. His early life was marked by luxury, but also ambition. Unlike many in his social class, Kofi wanted more than wealth. He wanted power. As a young man, he left his homeland to study abroad. His years in foreign universities were transformative. Kofi surrounded himself with intellectuals, revolutionaries, and political theorists. He studied revolutions, strategies for overthrowing governments, and how charismatic leaders could bend nations to their will. In heated discussions with fellow students, Kofi's vision for his future solidified. He did not see himself merely as a participant in his nation's politics. He saw himself as its ultimate ruler. His education sharpened his mind, but it also fueled his pride. When Kofi returned home, his country was teetering on the brink of collapse. The government was corrupt, and the people were growing restless. In the villages, hunger was rampant, and in the cities, discontent brewed in every corner. Protests erupted sporadically, only to be crushed by the military. The people were desperate for a leader, someone who could bring real change. Kofi saw this as his opportunity. He believed that he was the answer to the nation's problems, that he alone had the strength to lead. Kofi began organizing in the shadows. He held secret meetings with military officers disillusioned with the government and radical youth who were ready to fight for change. With his elite background, he had access to resources that many revolutionaries could only dream of, and he used this to build his movement. At first, it was small. Whispers of rebellion passed between trusted allies. But soon, Kofi's network grew. He gained the trust of key military leaders and began amassing an army, promising to liberate the country from its corrupt rulers. The revolution began with a series of strategic attacks on government installations. Kofi's forces, well coordinated and heavily armed, struck with precision, overwhelming the unprepared government troops. In the beginning, the people saw him as a hero. He presented himself as a liberator, a man who would bring justice and equality to a nation that had long been oppressed by the elite. His speeches were fiery and filled with promises of a better future. "We will no longer be ruled by corruption," Kofi declared in his first public address as a revolutionary leader. "This nation belongs to the people, and we will take it back." His words stirred the masses, and many joined his cause, believing in the vision he painted, a nation reborn, free from the chains of exploitation. As Kofi's forces grew stronger, so did his ambition. His army, once a small band of rebels, swelled with new recruits eager to fight for freedom. Village after village fell under his control, and with each victory, Kofi's influence expanded. But as his power grew, so too did his thirst for domination. What had begun as a revolution for justice slowly transformed into a war for absolute control. In the territories Kofi seized, loyalty was demanded, not earned. Villages were forced to provide food and shelter for his troops, and those who resisted were made examples of. At first, the people accepted this, believing it was a temporary sacrifice for the greater good. But as the conflict dragged on, Kofi's tactics became more brutal. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and soon, the lines between liberator and oppressor blurred. Kofi's army took whatever they needed from the people, food, supplies, and even young men to fight in the revolution. The once hopeful villagers now lived in fear of the man they had believed would save them. Dissenters were silenced, and any whisper of resistance within Kofi's ranks was met with swift and harsh punishment. The revolution was no longer about the people. It was about Kofi's rise to power. After years of bloody conflict, Kofi's forces finally seized the capital. The ruling government, weakened by years of corruption and unable to withstand Kofi's military might, collapsed. The streets filled with soldiers loyal to Kofi, and the people who had once cheered for liberation now found themselves under the control of a new regime. Kofi declared himself the nation's leader, promising peace and prosperity under his rule. But peace did not come. Instead, Kofi's reign was marked by paranoia, oppression, and unchecked greed. As soon as he took power, Kofi began consolidating his rule. He filled key government positions with loyalists, men who would not challenge his authority. He used the nation's wealth to fund his lavish lifestyle, while the rest of the country continued to suffer. The palaces he built for himself stood in stark contrast to the poverty outside their gates. Under Kofi's rule, the media was silenced, and political opposition was crushed. Secret police patrolled the streets, rooting out dissent before it could spread. Anyone suspected of opposing the regime, as arrested, often disappearing without a trace. The fear that gripped the nation was palpable. Even those who had once supported Kofi began to turn against him, but speaking out meant risking their lives. The people, who had once dreamed of freedom, now lived in a state of constant fear. Kofi's government imposed strict curfews, controlled the flow of information, and shut down any attempt at rebellion. His regime became infamous for its brutality, with public executions becoming a regular occurrence. Kofi believed that ruling through fear was the only way to maintain control, and so he ruled with an iron fist, showing no mercy to those who dared to oppose him. While Kofi's people starved, he continued to exploit the nation's resources for his own gain. Timber, oil, and minerals were sold to foreign buyers, with the profits funneled directly into Kofi's pockets. The country's wealth was drained, leaving the infrastructure to crumble. Hospitals closed, schools fell into disrepair, and entire regions were cut off from basic services. Yet Kofi remained isolated in his palace, surrounded by luxury, convinced that his rule would never end. As time passed, Kofi's paranoia deepened. He began to suspect even those closest to him of plotting against him. Ministers who had once been his trusted advisors were suddenly arrested and executed, accused of treason with little to no evidence. Kofi's inner circle grew smaller, and his distrust of others grew larger. His need for absolute control consumed him, and his decisions became increasingly erratic. The people, however, were no longer willing to live under Kofi's oppression. Protests began to break out in the capital and across the country. At first, the demonstrations were small, quickly suppressed by Kofi's forces. But as the economic crisis deepened and Kofi's brutality increased, the protests grew larger and more frequent. Opposition forces, once scattered and weak, began to unite, rallying around the cause of removing Kofi from power. Kofi's response was to double down on his repression. He sent his troops into the streets, ordering them to crush the protests by any means necessary. But this time, the people did not back down. The country had reached a breaking point, and no amount of force could contain the growing rebellion. Even Kofi's military began to turn against him, with soldiers defecting to the opposition in growing numbers. The once mighty dictator found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. His allies abandoned him, and his army, weakened by defections, could no longer protect him. Kofi fled the capital in the dead of night, hoping to find refuge in exile. But there was nowhere left for him to go. After months of hiding in remote regions of the country, he was captured by opposition forces. Kofi's fall from power was swift and humiliating. The man who had once commanded armies and ruled through fear was now a prisoner, his regime shattered. He was brought back to the capital to face trial for his crimes. The people who had suffered under his rule gathered in the streets, demanding justice. Kofi, who had once spoken with such confidence and authority, now stood before his nation as a broken man. The trial was brief. Kofi was found guilty of countless crimes, including corruption, mass murder, and human rights abuses. The court sentenced him to death, and the people rejoiced. For many, Kofi's execution was not just an act of justice. It was a symbol of the end of an era of terror. The nation that had been held in the grip of fear for so long could finally begin to rebuild. In the end, Kofi met the same fate he had inflicted on so many others. His execution was a public event, witnessed by the very people he had once ruled with an iron fist. As he was led to his death, there was no mercy, no sympathy, and no redemption. Kofi's life, marked by ambition, power, and destruction, came to a violent and ignoble end. But while Kofi's reign of terror was over, the damage he had caused would take generations to heal. His legacy was one of ruin, a once promising nation left devastated by greed, oppression, and fear. The people, though free from Kofi's rule, now faced the daunting task of rebuilding their shattered country. Kofi's rise and fall stand as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. His story is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the devastating consequences it can have on a nation. Leadership is not about control. It is about service. Kofi's life shows that when leaders forget this, they lead their people not to freedom, but destruction. The nation that Kofi left behind would slowly recover, but his name would be remembered not as a liberator, but as a tyrant. His story, like so many others, is a testament to the idea that power gained through fear can never be sustained, and that in the end, the people will always rise. What lessons can we take from Kofi's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more stories of power, leadership, and consequence.